Hi, good afternoon. I am Dr. Sonya Belcher, a licensed psychologist in Texas, and I have the privilege of introducing our guest, Dr. Erlanger Turner. Dr. Turner is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University. He is the author of the book Mental Health Among African Americans. In 2019, Dr. Turner founded the American Psychological Association's Division 53 LEAD Institute, which stands for Leadership Education to Advance Diversity. His work has been cited by publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Oprah Magazine, USA Today, NPR, and Psychology Today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Turner.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Well, Dr. Turner, could you explain what a person would experience if a person had anxiety and if the person had depression?
Yeah, those are really important questions. So I think one thing to recognize first is that we all experience some levels of sadness or anxiety or worries. And when that sort of crosses over into what may warrant someone working with someone like myself as a psychologist, those symptoms then become debilitating and impact their lives in many different ways. So if you experience depression, for example, you may have symptoms such as extreme sadness, difficulties with your sleep patterns, eating difficulties, problems concentrating and focusing, and those things are going to last for 2 weeks or more and impact your life in some type of way in terms of how you interact with others in terms of relationships, either romantic or interpersonally, how it may impact your work, or how it may impact the ways that you navigate other aspects of your social life. And anxiety is similar in terms of that when you experience these levels of, worry or anticipation of challenges in your life, that it is going to cause you some level of either trying to avoid situations that may bring more anxiety in your life, or you may have problems with, again, focusing, sort of somatic symptoms in terms of like sweating, muscle tension, and all of those other types of symptoms in your body.
I really appreciate, Dr. Turner, that you mentioned that it's not just an internal feeling, but it also impacts other areas in your life, like you said, like at work or school or interacting with other people. Let me ask you another question. What unique stressors do African American boys and men experience that result in anxiety and depression? And when should they seek help?
Yeah. Well, I mean that's obviously like a really challenging question to ask because there can
Hmm.
be
Yeah.
many things that impact our lives that
Yeah.
may result in some level of anxiety or depression. So I think one of the things that we know from looking at some of the research is what are these sociocultural factors and experiences that impact us in different ways that could result in anxiety or depression. So I think levels of discrimination and racism from the research that for people who have encounters that are racist or discriminatory, that it can increase some levels of sadness or may result in depression, depending on the severity of those situations. We also know one of the big issues that we've been seeing, you know, frequently over the last couple of years are increases with police violence and police brutality. And that's something that I think, some of the research that recently came out around sort of suicide risk has been really drawing this strong connection between the levels of witnessing this type of violence in our community and what is the impact of that on our mental health. And so I think whether you are having these sort of direct exposures to these incidents, or if you're experiencing these things vicariously through witnessing them either through the media or social media, we know that that can impact you on some type of way. And I think particularly for our boys and kids, is that they may also now have some anxiety or worries about their parents and their involvement with some of these types of systems that can also relate into some anxiety and depression that they may experience.
So I think a really good follow-up question is where could African American boys and men receive mental health assistance and what stops them from seeking help?
Yeah, that's a really good question because we know from looking at research that males are oftentimes less likely to seek out
Mhm.
services.
Mhm.
So one thing I think is really understanding that there are a lot of ways to access care. We know that therapy is available, some people maybe have some financial considerations that may limit access to those services. But I think now, as more people are receiving services through, let's say, online therapy outlets, that's another resource and tool to be able to access care. So there are a lot of different directories that you can look into to find services. And so I encourage people to sort of look at those directories to see where is someone that's available in your city and state to offer that care. In terms of what are some of the things that may prevent males from accessing care, I think one of the big things that I talk about often is how we're socialized as males from a really young age around sort of help seeking or talking about our emotions and feelings. And so I think that is a huge barrier that can prevent us from getting care, and that we want to deal with these things that we are experiencing in our lives by ourselves, and that we don't see this sort of benefit sometimes in working with a professional to be able to address some of those concerns. And because we're not always sort of socialized to talk about our emotions and feelings, it can also be really difficult to want to go to therapy and then sort of sit with someone and talk about those things emotionally that we may be dealing with for that extended period of time. And so that can be really uncomfortable to sort of get into those particular spaces. So I appreciate this conversation because I think it opens up the doors to really talk about how we can sort of shed some light on addressing some of these needs, and also being aware that that emotional restriction that we're socialized to do engage in, that you're not the only person that may have that type of experience.
So I just want to highlight a couple of things that you said, that how men are socialized not to express emotions, and that may prohibit them from going into counseling. And then, like, as we're talking about it now, that it is beneficial to talk about these things. It is important because it does impact us. And as you said earlier, other areas of our life, like our work, interacting with friends and family. Let me ask you another question. In your book, Mental Health Among African Americans, you emphasize the importance of mental health providers' sensitivity to the different values and cultures of their clients. Please summarize ways the value system and culture of people from African descent differ from people of European descent.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, one thing that, one reason that I really emphasize that is that I think in our training, oftentimes we focus on being inclusive and understanding sort of diversity. But I think once we get into practice, that can sort of shift in terms of what people actually do in real life. And so that's why I wanted to emphasize that point. I think one of the big things that oftentimes comes up is this focus on sort of religious or spiritual coping. And I think what we know from the numbers is that in terms of Black African American populations, about 80 to 90% engage in some type of religious practice or identify as being religious or spiritual. And those numbers significantly differ compared to white or European Americans. And so I think on one level, that is a huge area of social support and resilience to use those types of coping strategies. But on the other side, sometimes because we do are more likely to engage in religious types of coping, then that makes our desire to maybe go to therapy less. And so I think really understanding as an individual person in the public that there are ways to engage in therapy as well as continue those religious practices. And I think that's something that's really important for therapists to sort of acknowledge and have conversations with their clients about the ways that they can sort of work with them to address, some of these therapeutic aspects of it, but also how we can really empower them to continue to use some of those spiritual religious coping practices.
I really love that you talked about that, because there's some people that seek therapists that will allow them to talk about their religious way of handling situations, or their spirituality, and I guess some people don't realize that. So you bringing it up, I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Turner, we're going to have a couple other people who will join us in our discussion. It will be Dr. Denise Hunter and Mr. Isaac Palmer. Sorry about that. And let me just give you a little bit of information about the two of them. Mr. Isaac Palmer is the president of the MATCH Foundation, which stands for Minority Access to Comprehensive and Coordinated Healthcare. He is also the chair of the NAACP Southside Health Committee and a member of the Illinois Kidney Care Alliance. And Dr. Denise Hunter is a part of our Friends and Family for Health Equity, Dr. Hunter is an internal medicine physician, an adolescent wellness specialist, the founder of Wisdom Tea Finger, and the creator of Found. Thank you both for joining us in this discussion. So, Dr. Hunter, let's start with you.
Yes, Dr. Turner, thank you so much for that information. And you had brought up some kind of hinted around to some of the inequalities in the system. And I am a mother of 3 boys. And what advice do you have to share with myself and the viewing public on dealing with injustice and abuse of power?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, one thing that is really important is that we are really intentional about having those conversations about injustice. And I think sometimes for parents, and I'm not a parent, but I know for sometimes for parents, you feel that pressure to always have the right answers to questions. And so because you feel like you may not be prepared to talk about these types of injustices and that emotional aspect of it, we may tend to avoid those types of conversations with our kids. And so I think that is really helpful to have those conversations with children about injustice, and that you also provide that space for them to sort of share and acknowledge what their perceptions are or experiences are in relation to injustice, so that way you can really understand how they understand the world. I think oftentimes as adults, like we have an understanding from our own experiences, and we sort of share that with our children or kids, and we don't really check in with them to see how they've experienced the world. So I think it's really important that we sort of provide this space to say, this is going on in the world, or what have you witnessed in your school or in the community, in terms of some type of injustice or people being treated unfairly because of their skin, and really hear what their perspective is, and then try to sort of help them navigate what types of emotions they may experience through that.
I appreciate you saying that. I was, as you were talking, I was remembering we just went to a gas station, my son and I. We have an adolescent son, and we just got a snack. Like, we both got a snack. We're walking out, and before we walked out, when we paid for it, they asked if we wanted a bag, and I said to my son, no. I said to the cashier, no, but I specifically asked for a receipt. And then as we walked out, I was explaining to my son, if you don't get a bag, you need to get a receipt, because you always have to prove that you paid for it. And that just goes, like, as you were saying, having these conversations is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I still do that myself. And a lot of times people, I think at these places now, they start to not want to give you a receipt. I'm not sure why. And so I'm like, I always make sure that I get my receipt too, because you never know, how people are going to sort of perceive you. Like, as a society, we are oftentimes portrayed in the most negative light sometimes. And that's the first sort of bias or perception that people think about us. And I think particularly when it comes to like interactions with police, is that there isn't this grace that's allowed to white people when it comes to how they interact with police. But for us, it always, this bias or this perception of negativity or threats of harm is like that first sort of response. And so I think that's a really important point that you sort of brought up.
I'm glad you brought up the perspective. Oh, sorry, Mr. Farmer, you go ahead.
I'm just going to add on to that. The advice I got at that age was never leave a store running. And at the age of 47, literally 3 days ago, I caught myself stopping and calmly walking to my car as I left.
Slow it down.
Yeah.
It's funny, Mr. Turner, Dr. Turner, you brought up that kids have a different perspective. And I asked my sons, what do they know about what's happened recently in the recent events? And 3 of them all had 3 different perspectives. One of them actually had no idea what was going on in the news regarding the recent events. And 2 of them, the one in high school had no clue. And the ones in middle school, they've heard about it. And I asked, have you and your friends had any discussions about it? Does it come up in conversation? They're like, no, we don't talk about that. So sometimes we think that kids are just spending their hours just worrying about this. And I mean, I have a sample size of 3. I know they're much more than that in the population, and they have friends though, and they're at school, and they say that's not they're talking. I ask them, so what are y'all talking about? Well, what are we going to eat for lunch? And what lunch was the biggest subject. So I'm glad you put out there that really just understand the kid's perspective, and sometimes as parents we can put our fears on our children and not understand that yes, it's something real, but how much of our fear do we want to really put on them to burden them, to even honestly even skew the innocence of their childhood?
Yeah. I think that if you don't mind me asking Mr. Palmer a question, what are your thoughts on how to raise like Black kids, like boys in this country? It seems like it's really, really challenging, as Dr. Hunter said, trying not to put too much fear on them and keeping their innocence, but they also have to be aware of the society we live in.
Yeah, I recently took Dr. Turner's advice when he said earlier, you got to get to a place where you're comfortable saying, I don't know, with some of these issues. And I think the majority of the help is just bringing up a topic, saying, hey, let's talk about it. And then when the questions will come, especially from my two boys, they're very inquisitive, and then being able to say, I don't know, I don't have everything worked out. But I'm here for you when those situations come up. Can I pivot to a question to Dr. Turner? I work with a community group on the west side of Chicago, and that's predominantly Black. They work with recently released felons in the system. And the organizer last night called his group in. So he's got workers, he also has clients, and all he wanted to do was talk about the Tyree Nichols situation. And I was so blessed to be a part of it. But talking to you today, I realized there were no mental health professionals in that room. And we kind of stumbled through it. And to his credit, he was able to steer the conversation away from, well, who's at fault and the system and, the mayor. But how would you advise us if we were to have this conversation again? To get this discussion going where people in the community can just release and talk about the emotions and the feelings that they're experiencing. How would you structure that conversation? We probably had 15 to 20 people there, men and women, so it was equally represented.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And obviously, I think as mental health professionals, we're stretched really thin these days in terms of being able to provide services, and there's so much more of a need, and there's not enough of us. But I think one thing that is really helpful is, one, it's good that you provided that space. I think sometimes people hold in a lot of these emotions and feelings that they may be going through, and they don't have that avenue to do so. So I think that is helpful. The one thing that I try to encourage people to do, and I know things like some of these audio types of conversations have happened on social media over the years, where people can provide these spaces to have conversations, but then it gets into trauma dumping, or people really talking about these really stressful or traumatizing events, and then there isn't a professional to sort of help guide some of that conversation. So I would say, when you're having these conversations, provide that space, but also let people know that, to be mindful about who all is in the room, and that really be careful about the types of things that they do disclose, or how far they go with talking about some of these things that could be really traumatic, because it could be therapeutic and healing for them to share that information, but it might be triggering for somebody else. And that's the piece that we don't really know when people are sort of share this information. The other piece I would say too is, trying to make sure that you have some resources that are available. So I think when people are having these types of conversations, and even if you have a professional there or you don't, they don't know, well, what's the next step? And maybe you did this, I don't know, but I think just making sure that people know where to go if they do want to seek help. So finding where are these local resources where they can provide access to services, or can you connect with professional psychology organizations. So I know that the Association of Black Psychologists, at least in Chicago, tends to be very active in the community and do a lot of things. And so finding ways to maybe partner with those organizations to find out what are the resources in your area to be able to help those that may be looking for therapists.
That's great.
Dr. Turner, I feel like I just heard a new term that I'm going to add to my repertoire: trauma dumping. That's happened so many times. Now I know what to call it.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and given the height of what we're all experiencing with Tyre Nichols, I think it's great that we're having this conversation and that we can set limits with some people that may not be able to, or not be able to at that moment, to talk about it in detail because they feel exhausted or they feel overwhelmed, they feel helpless. And I think giving them permission and not guilting them that they need to continue that conversation because this is happening, that we give them space, that they need to have that space, and that we allow them to have that space. I think that's important. But also, as you all were saying, making sure that people have resources that they can reach out to people if they need to talk through in more detail what they're experiencing, because it can be really emotionally heavy to yet again deal with something like Tyre Nichols. I appreciate all of you all coming and joining with us. Thank you, Dr. Turner. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Thank you, Dr. Hunter, for joining us. I just want to summarize real quickly some of the things that we got, how important it is to talk about depression and anxiety, to know what it is and to do something about it, to seek out resources, to get help, because it is important. It's not just something that you deal with internally. It will affect other areas of your life. To check in with children, with adolescents, to see how they're doing, to make sure that they are managing all the things that's happening in this world well, and to find resources. There are more resources out there than we've had ever before. Looking online to see if you can do telehealth counseling, if you can't do and go to a therapist, or seeing what other resources that are out there. There are many, many other resources. Please find help if you need that.